today, wow, we are plunging into a text that has, well, fascinated, repelled, and frankly confused readers for centuries. Niccolò Machiavelli's The Prince.
It really has that effect, doesn't it?
Yeah, the scholar James B. Atkinson put it perfectly. He said, many people finish this book and just wonder what the shouting was all about. It provokes such strong reactions.
It absolutely does.
So what is it? What's the deal with this book that makes it so endlessly captivating and, let's be honest, controversial, even after all this time?
That's a great question, and it's pretty much our mission for this deep dive. We want to explore Machiavelli's truly groundbreaking ideas, yes, but also the very personal situation he was in that shaped this work.
Okay.
And crucially, the surprising relevance, how his insights into power, human nature, leadership, how they still resonate today.
So we're going straight into the text.
Exactly. Directly into the Prince itself, using this excellent scholarly introduction and notes we have as our guide to really get at its core message.
Good.
And it's worth mentioning right off the bat, we call it The Prince in English, but Machiavelli himself actually called it a little work on princedoms, uno opusculo de principatibus.
Princedoms, so not just for princes.
Right. It's a more generic term. It reflects its broader applicability really to any kind of ruler, anyone in charge, not just some literal hereditary prince.
Okay, that makes sense. So to really understand the prince, we need to understand the man, right, and the world he lived in. It sounds like it was pretty messy.
Oh, absolutely. You can't separate the book from the man or his time. What were the key forces that shaped Niccolò Machiavelli, and how did his own turbulent life experience lead to such a potent text?
Let's unpack that.
He was born in Florence, 1469. Florence was a major hub, commerce, industry, lots going on.
But politically unstable.
Extremely. It wasn't like a kingdom with a clear monarch. Florence had this incredibly complex, constantly shifting system. The signoria, various councils like the Council of the People, Council of the Commune, this position called the Standard Bearer of Justice.
Sounds complicated.
It was a whirlwind, a web of checks and balances that often just resulted in gridlock, infighting. Power was always up for grabs, always being challenged. No ruler ever felt truly secure, and that really sinks into Machiavelli's thinking.
Okay, so that's the backdrop.
Yeah.
And then things get even more shaken up. The Medici family gets kicked out in 1494.
Exactly. That leads to this period they called a free government.
Yeah.
And Machiavelli, he actually gets his first public service job shortly after Savonarola, the fiery preacher, was executed in 1498.
Did he admire Savonarola?
Not really. He privately judged that Savonarola had whitewashed his lies, but Machiavelli himself, he threw himself into public service. He was dedicated, reelected every year for 14 years, deeply involved in diplomacy, military stuff.
Including getting Pisa back.
Yes, the recovery of Pisa in 1509 was a big deal, and he played a role. But then came 1512. He called it the bitterest year of his life.
Why? What happened?
Disaster. His citizen militia, which he'd worked hard to build, was defeated at Prato by the Spanish. The Medici came back to power in Florence, and Machiavelli. He was suspected of conspiracy, arrested, briefly imprisoned.
Tortured.
Yes, tortured. And then forced into retirement, basically exiled to his small farm outside the city, a complete reversal of fortune.
Wow. And it's from that place, that low point, that the prince comes.
Precisely. And what's really striking is how he describes this period in a famous letter to his friend Francesco Vittori. It paints this incredible picture.
Tell me about it.
During the day, he says he's out acting the bumpkin, hanging out with local butchers, bakers, arguing over cards in the tavern, just trying to get by.
Okay.
But then in the evening, he describes this dramatic transformation. He takes off his filthy, mud-stained clothes, puts on regal and courtly robes, his words, and enters his study.
To do what?
To converse with the ancients. He says he feeds on the food that alone is mine, talking with the great thinkers and historians of the past. It's this amazing contrast, right? His humble, rural reality versus this intense, ongoing intellectual life.
That's incredible. So the book emerges from that, from hardship, but also this deep thinking.
Exactly. The prince comes directly out of this period. And his motivation, you have to understand, was profound, but also desperate.
Desperate, how?
He explicitly wrote that he wanted the Medici, the family who just overthrown the government he served, to engage my services, even if they should start by having me push around a stone.
Just give him any job.
Any job.
Yeah.
He said he was driven by deep poverty. He kept stressing his experience, those 15 years studying the art of the state, a time he claimed when he'd neither slept nor played. He believed he was uniquely qualified.
It was poverty.
He actually declared his poverty was a witness to my honesty and goodness. Look, I didn't enrich myself in office. So The prince wasn't just some abstract philosophical exercise for him. It was a CV, a pitch, a very urgent personal bid to get back into the game.
Okay, so he's lived through all this chaos, seen power shift brutally, suffered personally, and now he's trying to get back in. That context is crucial. How did it shape the way he wrote about power? What was so different about his approach?
It was revolutionary, really, especially compared to the usual advice books for rulers back then.
Which were like, what, idealistic?
Very much full of what ought to be.
Yeah.
Social niceties, ethical guidelines, moral platitudes, stuff that sounded good but maybe didn't reflect reality. Machiavelli explicitly rejected that.
So what did he propose instead?
He said he wanted to go straight to the actual truth of matters rather than to a conception about it.
La verità effettuale della cosa. The effectual truth.
What does that mean, effectual truth? It means looking at how things actually work. What actions actually lead to success or failure in the real world of politics. It was an empirical approach based on observation, on history, on what he himself had seen.
And his writing style reflects that.
Oh, definitely. The source notes point out how his rhetoric swings between charming and shocking the reader. It's a deliberate strategy. He wants to grab you, shake you up, make you reconsider things you thought you knew. He's not trying to offer easy answers. He wants to force you to confront uncomfortable truths.
That directness, that unvarnished truth, it still feels jarring today, doesn't it? Why do you think that approach is still so powerful, and how does it cut through all the noise we have today?
I think it's impactful precisely because it cuts through the usual fluff. It goes straight to the core mechanics of power, which, let's face it, haven't changed that much. It's timeless.
And you mentioned he uses metaphors.
Yes, and very effectively. That directness allowed him to build consistency using really vivid metaphors. They weren't just decoration, they were analytical tools.
Like the medical ones.
Exactly, that's a recurring theme. The state is like a body. It can get sick. A prince needs to be like a doctor, sometimes prescribing remedies or even strong medicines. He compares certain political problems to pulmonary tuberculosis, easy to cure early on, hard to diagnose, easy to diagnose later, but almost impossible to cure.
Implying you need to act decisively and early.
Precisely. He even calls social classes umori, like the ancient humors of the body that need to be kept in balance. It all paints a picture of the state as a fragile organism needing pragmatic, sometimes harsh, treatment to survive.
Are there other key metaphors?
Yes, architectural and horticultural ones too. He talks a lot about laying foundations for a state. You need strong foundations or it won't last. He compares states formed too quickly, maybe through luck, to plants without deep roots and branches easily uprooted by the first storm.
So foresight planning.
Yes. Human foresight and action are needed to build something lasting, something that can withstand the inevitable challenges. These metaphors make his points stick. They make the abstract concrete.
Okay, let's get into the core concepts. Two words always come up: virtue and fortune. They sound fundamental. What exactly did Machiavelli mean by them, and how do they relate? Let's start with virtue. It sounds like virtue, but...
Right, but it's not quite our modern sense of moral virtue being good. For Machiavelli, virtue is something different. It's more dynamic effectiveness.
Effectiveness.
Yeah. The source describes it as a kind of flexibility that can initiate effective, efficient, and energetic action based on a courageous assertion of the will and an ability to execute the products of one's own calculation.
Okay, that's a mouthful. So it's about skill, competence.
Exactly. Adaptable competence. It includes the mental side, like Machiavelli's own brain power, his ability to analyze internal mental virtue, but also the ability to act decisively in the world. External virtue manifest in action. It's about human agency, foresight, proactive leadership. Think of it as political prowess or agility.
Got it. Proactive skill. So how does that wrestle with fortune, which sounds like the opposite, like fate or luck?
That's the constant tension in the book. Machiavelli readily admits that fortune, sheer luck or circumstance, controls maybe half of our actions. You can't control everything.
How does he picture fortune?
Famously as a raging river. It's powerful, destructive. But, he says, that doesn't mean you're helpless. When the river is calm, you need to build dikes and embankments, defenses, preparations.
So foresight again. Prepare for the worst.
Right. Mitigate fortune's power through virtue. But then he adds another image, a more controversial one.
Yes.
He also pictures fortune as a woman, and he says she's more often won over by men who are impetuous, forceful, who treat her roughly, rather than those who are cautious.
That sounds problematic today.
It definitely lands differently now, but it highlights a paradox. You need to be both cautious, building dikes, and impetuous, acting boldly. Yet, he notes, no single person can easily be both. Temperaments differ.
So how do you resolve that?
The key, he suggests, is for a prince to be flexible enough to adjust his tactics to the conditions of the times, to recognize whether the moment calls for caution or for bold action. That ability to adapt is virtue responding to fortune. This tension, this interplay between what you can control and what you can't fortune, it runs through the entire book.
Okay, so virtue is your skill, fortune is the chaos of the world, and you need to use your skill to navigate or sometimes even master that chaos. Given that framework, what are the really practical, maybe even shocking, takeaways for a ruler trying to get and keep power? He doesn't hold back, does he?
No, he definitely does not. One of the absolute most famous bits comes in chapter 17. Is it better to be feared or loved?
The classic question.
Right. And Machiavelli acknowledges, sure, being loved is nice, compassion is desirable. But, he argues, a prince ought not to worry about the opprobrium of ruthlessness through which he keeps his subjects united and loyal.
So don't worry about being called cruel if it keeps order.
Basically, yes. And his conclusion, if you can't be both feared and loved, it is much safer to be feared.
Why feared?
Because, he says, love is held by a chain of obligation which, since men are inherently self-interested, is easily broken whenever it serves their purpose. But fear is supported by a dread of retribution which can always be counted on. Fear is reliable. Love isn't.
Wow. That's a pretty bleak view of people.
It is. Very pragmatic, maybe cynical, depending on your view. But for Machiavelli, it's about what works to maintain the state. Stability above all else.
Does he worry about that fear turning into hatred, though, leading to rebellion?
Yes, that's a crucial distinction for him. Be feared, yes, but avoid being hated. And how do you avoid hatred? This leads to another one of his really stark observations.
Well,
he states, quite bluntly, men are quicker to forget the death of a father than the loss of an inheritance.
Seriously, people care more about property than family.
That's his assessment of human motivation. And the practical advice that follows is crystal clear. A prince must, above all else, keep his hands off the property of his subjects and citizens. Don't take their stuff. And don't mess with their women, he adds. Those are the things that breed deep, unforgiving hatred. Violence might be forgotten, or at least managed, but taking property, never.
Chillingly insightful, maybe. Really cuts deep into what drives people. Protect their property. Okay. But Machiavelli isn't just about actions, right? He talks a lot about image, perception.
Absolutely. Appearance versus reality is huge for him. This comes up strongly in chapter 18.
That's the core idea there.
He says a prince need not actually have all the qualities I enumerated, things like compassion, faithfulness, honesty, piety, but it is absolutely necessary that he seem to have them.
Seem to have them.
Yeah.
So fake it.
Essentially, yes. Seem compassionate, faithful, humane, frank, pious. Appear to be all those things. But, and this is the key, you must have the inner knowledge and the ability to become the opposite when necessity requires it. You need the mental flexibility to act against those appearances if the state demands it.
That sounds incredibly cynical. Just maintain an illusion.
For Machiavelli, it's about the outcome. He concludes that chapter by saying, people judge all men's actions, and particularly those of a prince, by the final outcome. Therefore, let a prince be the conqueror and the supporter of the state. If you succeed in maintaining the state, the means will always be judged honorable. The ends justify the means, essentially. This idea of the illusion of power and authority is central.
So if you win, history will forgive the methods.
That seems to be his argument. How do you manage this duality? He uses the famous allegory of Chiron the centaur.
The half-man, half-horse.
Right. Who tutored ancient heroes and princes. Machiavelli says a prince must know how to use both natures, the beast and the man. From the beast, you learn from the lion how to be forceful, to overcome opponents directly, and from the fox how to be cunning, to recognize traps, to use guile and deception. You need both force and fraud sometimes.
Man, beast, lion, fox. It's a complex toolkit.
It is. It's about adapting your methods to the situation, using whatever nature is required.
Okay, this pragmatic, even ruthless view applies to dealing with potential enemies. How does it extend to a prince's relationship with his own people, and especially his military?
It's just as stark, particularly regarding armies. Machiavelli is absolutely scathing about relying on mercenaries or auxiliary troops armies borrowed from other powers. This is in chapters 12 and 13.
Why so critical?
He blames Italy's weakness and repeated invasions directly on its princes relying on these kinds of forces. He calls them useless and dangerous. Mercenaries fight only for money, they're undisciplined, disloyal. Auxiliaries are loyal to their own ruler, not you.
So they're either ineffective or a threat.
Exactly. He famously says Charles VIII of France conquered Italy with chalk, meaning his officials just had to mark with chalk which houses their soldiers would lodge in. There was so little resistance, because Italy relied on mercenaries.
So what's the alternative?
Your own army,
Yep.
raised from your own citizens or subjects. His principle is absolutely clear. Without its own armies, no princedom is secure. He champions a citizen militia like the one he tried to build in Florence. He says nothing is as insecure and transient as a reputation for authority that is not supported by one's own forces. You need your own loyal strength.
Rely on your own people. Does that extend beyond the military? How should a prince build support among the general population?
Yes, very much. In Chapter 9, he talks about civil princedoms, where a ruler comes to power with the support of the citizens. And he makes a really interesting point. It's better to have the support of the common people than the nobles or the rich. Because, he says, the common people desire only not to be oppressed. Their goal is fundamentally defensive and therefore more honorable and easier to satisfy. The nobles, the rich, they want to oppress others, and their ambition is harder to manage. Lean on the people.
That sounds almost democratic.
Maybe not democratic, that's certainly populist in a way. It connects to his advice in Chapter 8 about using cruelty well or badly. If you must inflict injuries, do it all at once. Get the necessary nasty business over with quickly so people can forget, and you can start distributing benefits, which should be done little by little so they are savored more. Don't engage in constant nagging cruelty.
Get the pain over with fast. What about physical defenses like castles? Are they useful?
He tackles fortresses in Chapter 20. His view is nuanced. Yes, they can be useful sometimes. But he argues forcefully that the best fortress is not being hated by your people.
Because they could just deceive you or betray you.
Exactly. He gives the example of a fortress in Bologna built by Pope Julius II. The people hated the Pope's rule, revolted, and tore the fortress down. Popular hatred will undermine any wall you build. Focus on not being hated first.
Okay, so rely on your own army. Cultivate popular support, or at least avoid hatred. Get tough stuff done quickly. What about the people immediately around the prince? Advisors, courtiers, they seem like a potential danger zone.
Huge danger zone, especially flatterers. Machiavelli dedicates Chapter 23 to this. Flattery is a plague, he says. How do you avoid it but still get honest advice?
Tricky balance.
His solution is what he calls a third method. Don't let everyone offer advice freely. That leads to chaos and lack of respect. Don't allow no advice. That leads to ignorant decisions. Instead, choose wise men for his government.
A select few.
Right. And give only them full authority to speak the truth to him, and only on those matters he asks about, nothing else. They should know they won't be punished for honesty, but they shouldn't offer opinions unasked.
So the prince stays in control of the agenda.
Crucially. And Machiavelli stresses, ultimately, the quality of the advice depends on the prince's own prudence. A wise prince will get good advice and know how to use it. A prince who isn't wise won't be well advised no matter who he picks. If he relies too heavily on one brilliant advisor, that advisor will likely end up taking over the state. The prince's wisdom must be the foundation.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Now, Machiavelli doesn't just give abstract advice. He uses lots of historical examples, right? Figures who illustrate his points, for better or worse. Were some key ones.
Oh, absolutely. History is his laboratory. And the figure who looms largest, especially in Chapter 7, is Cesare Borgia.
Duke Valentino, son of a pope, not exactly a choir boy.
Definitely not. Machiavelli doesn't present him as a moral hero, but as a fascinating, complex model of virtue in action. Borgia acquired his state largely through his father's influence, through fortune.
But he acted decisively once he had it.
Immensely so. Machiavelli details how Borgia ruthlessly eliminated rivals, established order through his cruel but effective lieutenant Ramiro de Orco, whom he later had executed to distance himself from the cruelty, tried to build his own power base independent of the French and the Pope. His Borgia used every method and did everything a man with prudence and virtue ought to.
So why did he fail in the end?
Machiavelli attributes it to fortune again. His father, Pope Alexander VI, died unexpectedly, and Cesare himself fell gravely ill at the exact same critical moment. Bad luck, essentially. Not a failure of virtue. Machiavelli almost creates Borgia as this powerful fiction, as the source says, to show the absolute limits of what virtue could achieve, even against overwhelming odds. He's a case study in calculated action.
Okay, Borgia as the model of effective, ruthless action. Any other key figures? Perhaps ones who weren't quite so successful or used different methods.
He discusses Ferdinand V of Spain, the King of Aragon, in Chapter 21. Ferdinand is presented as an example of a prince who achieved great prestige through great enterprises,
Like what?
like constantly keeping his nobles and people occupied with grand campaigns, often fought abroad. But Machiavelli also points out, quite critically, how Ferdinand used religion as a cloak of religiosity
How so?
to justify what Machiavelli calls sanctimonious pieces of ruthlessness, specifically expelling the Jews and Moors from Spain. Machiavelli clearly finds the act deplorable in its execution, but he acknowledges its political effectiveness in uniting the kingdom and enhancing Ferdinand's reputation, at least in certain circles. It's a stark example of the gap between public image and brutal reality.
Using religion for political ends. Still relevant today.
Very much. And then, looking at failures, Machiavelli has harsh words for the Italian princes of his own time.
In chapter 24.
Yes, he delivers this blistering indictment. Why did they lose their states so easily to foreign invaders? Not because of bad fortune, he insists, but because of their own indolence, their own laziness and incompetence.
What were they doing wrong?
They cared more about personal pleasures than in arms. They neglected military training, they didn't prepare defenses, they alienated their people, and when trouble came, they ran away, hoping someone else would restore them. They became, as he puts it, the spoils of anybody who attacked them. He blames their softness, their lack of virtue, entirely.
A harsh judgment. And this criticism of Italian weakness, it leads into the final, really passionate part of the book, doesn't it? Chapter 26, his call for Redeemer.
Yes, it's quite a shift in tone. Suddenly, the cool analyst becomes this passionate patriot. He describes Italy as desperate. Leaderless, lawless, defeated, despoiled, lacerated, laid low. He says Italy is praying to God for someone, anyone, to free her from the barbarous cruelties of foreign occupiers.
And he thinks it's possible.
He clearly believes that a new prince, perhaps from the Medici family, to whom the book is dedicated, equipped with the kind of virtue he's described throughout the book, could rise up and achieve this unification and liberation of Italy. It reveals this deep underlying patriotism beneath all the cold political realism. He actually saw a practical path, using his principles, to national salvation.
So we've really gone deep into Machiavelli's The Prince. We've looked at his pretty radical way of looking at truth, that interplay of skill, virtue, and luck, fortune, and some really stark, maybe uncomfortable advice on leadership.
Yeah, it's a text that definitely peels back the layers, doesn't it? It exposes the raw mechanics of power, often hidden beneath politeness or ideology.
We've covered some key takeaways.
Yeah.
The absolute need for your own loyal forces.
Relying on yourself.
The danger of getting caught up in appearances without the substance to back it up.
And that chilling, pragmatic advice on managing fear, property, cruelty. I mean, that line, men are quicker to forget the death of a father than the loss of an inheritance. It's brutal, but it really encapsulates his unsentimental view of what truly motivates people.
Yeah. Ultimately, Machiavelli challenges us, even today, to look past conventional morality sometimes and just consider the actual truth of matters, what actually works when it comes to governing effectively. He forces you to ask, what are the real choices leaders face? And what are the consequences, maybe, of not being ruthless or deceptive when the situation demands it?
It's deeply uncomfortable, but maybe necessary to consider. Which leaves us with a final thought, perhaps. Given everything we've discussed about seeming versus being, about perception, what does Machiavelli's emphasis on the illusion of power and authority mean for us today? For leaders, sure, but also for citizens living in a world where media, spin, and perception often feel like they are reality. How do we navigate that?